He began to drive to the very forward edges of the front lines, and often beyond them. Not in a heavily escorted convoy befitting a corps commander, but in an unmarked jeep, a lone, unassuming vehicle. No security detail, no retinue of aides, just himself, a driver, usually Sergeant Mims, and occasionally one junior aide, handpicked for their ability to keep silent and their readiness to face sudden death. "If I bring a convoy," Patton would explain with a dismissive wave of his hand, "the Germans know I'm important, and they shoot at me. If I bring one jeep, I look like a lost supply officer. Nobody bothers a lost supply officer." The logic, while undeniably audacious, was also disturbingly sound in its own twisted way. A kind of inverse psychology applied to the battlefield. The first time he enacted this perilous philosophy in France, his intelligence officer, a meticulous captain named Davies, almost suffered a nervous breakdown. He found Patton, hours later, back at headquarters, sketching furiously on a map, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "Sir," Davies stammered, his face pale, "our forward observer just reported your jeep 3 miles past our forward positions, deep into German-held territory. You were behind enemy lines." Patton merely grunted, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "I know. Found a perfect route for our tanks. The Germans haven't minded yet. We attack tomorrow at dawn before they figure it out." The attack, launched with a daring swiftness that caught the Germans entirely off guard, succeeded brilliantly. Tanks poured through a sector they had deemed impassable, crumbling defenses and sowing panic. Patton was vindicated. His staff was, once again, profoundly traumatized, their nerves frayed. The pattern was established. The lost supply officer would become a phantom on the battlefield, a harbinger of sudden, overwhelming force. And Mims, his ever-present shadow, began to understand that his job description now included a high probability of spontaneous, unauthorized excursions into enemy territory, often bordering on suicide. August 1944. The relentless drive across France continued, a whirlwind of dust, blood, and strategic genius. Patton, ever at the vanguard, was en route with Sergeant Mims to visit a forward headquarters, a routine inspection that, in Patton's world, was never truly routine. This time, however, fate, or perhaps simply the chaotic nature of war-torn European roads, intervened. They took a wrong turn, a genuine, uncalculated mistake, not one of Patton's deliberate probes into the unknown. The signs, often defaced or destroyed, offered little guidance through the ravaged landscape. Mims, his senses always hyper-alert when in the general's presence, was the first to notice. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice low, "that sign we just passed, it wasn't in French." Patton, who had been studying his maps with a casual intensity that belied their dangerous proximity to the front, looked up. He scanned their surroundings. They were in a small village, surprisingly intact. No telltale signs of recent battle, no ruined buildings, no shattered vehicles, no American troops. A strange, unsettling quiet hung in the air, broken only by the distant caw of a crow, a chilling silence that felt heavier than any battle noise. "I think we're behind enemy lines, Mims," the sergeant added, his voice tighter now, a thin thread of controlled panic running through it. Patton simply nodded, his expression unreadable, a faint glint in his eyes that Mims had come to recognize as a precursor to either brilliant improvisation or utter madness. "Looks that way," Patton agreed, his tone utterly calm, as if discussing the weather. He had a way of normalizing the absurd. As if on cue, a German soldier emerged from a dilapidated farmhouse, a bucket in his hand, heading towards a well. He glanced up, saw the American jeep, and froze. His eyes, wide with confusion and a dawning horror, darted from Mims to Patton, then back again. His grip on the bucket loosened, and it clattered to the cobbled street, spilling water across the ancient stones. Patton, with a casualness that bordered on the surreal, simply raised a hand and waved. A friendly, almost neighborly gesture in the heart of enemy territory. The German soldier, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight of an enemy general casually waving in his own backyard, slowly, tentatively, waves back. A moment of absurd, shared humanity in the midst of total war. A fleeting connection between enemies. "Drive, Mims," Patton said quietly, his voice a low command, almost a whisper. "Slowly, like we're supposed to be here." Mims, his stomach doing somersaults, a cold knot of dread tightening in his gut, reluctantly complied. He eased the Jeep forward, maintaining a leisurely, almost indifferent pace. They drove through the entire village, past German soldiers who looked up from their chores, past military vehicles parked haphazardly, past a German officer who glanced at them with a momentary flicker of curiosity, then dismissed them as some inconsequential support vehicle, perhaps an aid convoy from another unit, just lost. They simply didn't recognize the danger, the audacity of the lone American Jeep. It was an invisibility cloak woven from pure nerve. Only when they had cleared the village, the last German sentry fading into the rearview mirror, and were undeniably back within American territory, did Mims finally exhale a breath he realized he'd been holding for what felt like an eternity. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with cold sweat. "Sir," he began, his voice hoarse, "that was unorthodox." Patton cut him off, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "That, Mims, was good intelligence." He paused, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "That village has about 200 Germans in it. Light weapons, no tanks. We'll take it tonight." And they did. The Third Army, acting on this most unconventional of reconnaissance reports, captured the village with minimal resistance. When the bewildered German commander was later interrogated, he mentioned something peculiar. "An American Jeep drove through our position yesterday," he recounted, still shaking his head in disbelief. "We thought it was just a reconnaissance probe. By the time we realized they'd actually stopped to observe us, they were gone." Such audacity. We never imagined a general would be so foolhardy. The interrogator, bound by the confidentiality of military operations, wisely did not inform him that the reconnaissance probe had been the commanding general of the Third Army himself, the very embodiment of audacious courage. September 1944 found the American advance pressing towards the Moselle River, a formidable natural barrier across which the retreating German forces had systematically destroyed most bridges. The challenge was immense. American engineers, their faces grimed with effort, were diligently scouting for suitable crossing points, painstakingly assessing currents, riverbeds, and enemy strongholds. But Patton, true to form, possessed little patience for bureaucratic delays or committee reports. He considered direct observation paramount, the only true source of actionable intelligence. Dismissing the meticulous work of his engineering corps, he drove himself to the river, Mims at the wheel, parking the Jeep in a cluster of sparse, shell-blasted trees that offered meager concealment. With a swift, decisive movement, he disembarked, leaving the relative concealment of the vehicle. He began to walk along the riverbank, completely exposed, a solitary figure against the vast, watery expanse. He was well within easy rifle range from the German side, a fact that sent a fresh wave of ice-cold dread through Sergeant Mims and his accompanying aide, Lieutenant Peterson. The air was crisp, carrying the chill of the river and the scent of damp earth. "Sir," Peterson hissed, his voice barely a whisper, an urgent plea that caught in his throat. "The Germans can see you from across the river. They'll be drawing a bead on you any second. You're a sitting duck." Patton, however, remained utterly unfazed. He simply raised his binoculars to his eyes, scanning the opposite bank with a serene, almost detached focus. "I can see them too, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of any discernible fear. His gaze was fixed, dissecting the enemy positions, analyzing the subtle nuances of the terrain as if he were merely admiring a landscape painting. Indeed, German soldiers on the far side, initially confused by the lone American officer, soon spotted him. A few, veterans of countless skirmishes, instinctively raised their Mausers, their scopes trained on the seemingly oblivious figure. Yet, no shots came. The Germans, paralyzed by an almost superstitious bewilderment, hesitated. Why was an American officer standing so openly, so calmly, so audaciously observing them? Was it a trap? A highly skilled decoy? The sheer insolence of it baffled their tactical minds, breaking their ingrained discipline. Patton remained motionless, a statue of defiance carved against the gray sky, the binoculars fixed to his eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only 5 long, excruciating minutes. After those 5 minutes, an eternity in a kill zone, Patton slowly lowered the binoculars. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips, a rare sight. "Found our crossing point," he announced, his voice carrying the certainty of revelation. 300 yards downstream. Waters shallow enough for Sherman's." Mims and Peterson exchanged incredulous glances. "Sir, how can you tell?" Peterson dared to ask, his voice tinged with awe and disbelief. Patton gestured expansively with a gloved hand. "Look at the current, Lieutenant. See how it flows, how it eddies around those rocks. Look at the rocks themselves, the exposed bedrock. And most importantly, look at where the Germans aren't defending. They're not stupid. They're not defending there because they don't think we can cross there. It's too obvious, too simple." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the 2 younger men. "Can we?" Mims asked, a tremor in his voice. "We'll find out tomorrow," Patton replied, the familiar glint in his eyes returning. A challenge daring fate itself. The following day, American forces crossed the Moselle at the precise spot Patton had identified. His intuitive eye for terrain, his almost mystical connection to the battlefield, proved correct once more. The engineers, who had spent days compiling their data, watched in stunned admiration as the first tanks rumbled across the unexpectedly shallow waters. Patton's method was unorthodox, undeniably reckless, but uncannily effective. He saw what others couldn't, not because he was better equipped, but because he was willing to stand where no sane man would, embracing the raw, untamed reality of the battlefield. A general who literally walked into the enemy's sights to gain an advantage. November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, a dark, suffocating labyrinth of twisted trees and treacherous terrain, became the next improbable theater for Patton's audacious personal reconnaissance. He was scouting for a planned offensive, navigating the dense, unforgiving woods that intelligence reports had optimistically labeled lightly held by German forces, a phrase that often translated to heavily defended by desperate, dug-in men. His jeep, with Sergeant Mims carefully guiding it along a narrow, winding forest track, crept forward. The engine's low growl was swallowed by the oppressive silence of ancient pines. The air was damp and bitterly cold, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the distant, unsettling echo of unseen conflict. Overhead, the thick canopy formed a perpetual twilight, casting long, shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, heightened the tension to an almost unbearable degree. Both Mims and Patton were acutely aware of the unseen eyes that might be watching, the unseen barrels that might be tracking their movements. Suddenly, as they rounded a sharp, blind bend, the world exploded into a frozen tableau. They stumbled directly into a German patrol, a full squad, perhaps a dozen men, their camouflaged uniforms blending seamlessly with the dappled light filtering through the gloom. The Germans were in the process of setting up a temporary bivouac, their faces etched with the weariness of war, their weapons momentarily stacked nearby. Both groups spotted each other simultaneously. For a frozen, agonizing moment, time itself seemed to suspend. The forest held its breath. American and German, eyes locked, instinctually reaching for weapons, creating a silent, deadly standoff. Then, with a fluid, almost theatrical movement that defied belief and common sense, Patton stood up in the Jeep. His M1 helmet seemed to catch a sliver of the muted sunlight gleaming with defiant purpose. His right hand, swift as a viper, went to his hip, drawing one of his infamous pearl-handled revolvers. He leveled it, with an unwavering steadiness that betrayed no fear, at the shocked German soldiers. "Hände hoch!" he bellowed, his German admittedly terrible, a guttural roar that nevertheless sliced through the tension like a physical blade. "Hands up!" The German soldiers, hardened veterans of both Eastern and Western fronts, looked at each other, then back at the lone American general, then at the single bewildered driver. 12 armed men against 2. The odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. They could easily have overwhelmed the Jeep, killed the audacious Americans, and vanished back into the forest as if the encounter had never happened. Their initial shock gave way to a flicker of defiance, a momentary readiness to fight. But something about Patton's absolute, unwavering confidence, his complete and utter lack of fear, seemed to short-circuit their warrior instincts. His eyes, burning with an almost mad intensity, seemed to strip away their resolve, to paralyze their will. There was no doubt, no tremor, no uncertainty in his posture, only an indomitable will radiating from him like a palpable force field. He was a force of nature, an elemental presence that seemed to command their immediate submission. Slowly, one German soldier, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing terror, his hands already half raised in an instinctive gesture of self-preservation, completed the motion. Then another and another, until the entire squad, their weapons clattering uselessly to the damp forest floor, stood with their hands held high, eyes wide with incomprehension and a chilling respect for this madman who dared to challenge them against impossible odds. "Mims," Patton said, his voice surprisingly calm, never once lowering his revolver, "radio for infantry. We have prisoners." Mims, his jaw slack with a mixture of terror and awe, finally found his voice, shaking his head. "Sir, the radio doesn't have enough range in these woods. We're too deep, too far from our lines for a clear signal." Patton's eyes narrowed for a brief moment, a flicker of irritation at the technical impediment, then a decisive glint returned. "Then drive back and get them. I'll wait here." Mimes's blood ran cold. "Sir, you can't stay here alone, with 12 armed German soldiers," he protested, a desperate plea in his voice. Patton simply fixed him with a stare that brooked no argument, a silent command that was absolute. "Sure, I can. They're surrendering. Go." Against every fiber of his being, against every trained instinct of self-preservation, Mims slowly reversed the Jeep, then turned it, his hands clammy on the wheel. He drove away, leaving Patton standing alone, revolver drawn, facing a dozen disarmed but still dangerous German soldiers, deep in enemy territory. For 20 long, excruciating minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats, Patton stood in the Jeep, his weapon pointed, his gaze unwavering, staring down his unlikely prisoners. None of them moved. They were too confused, too uncertain, too utterly convinced by the terrifying conviction in the general's eyes that any sudden movement would be met with swift and deadly force. The forest held its breath once more. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant, unseen murmur of the battlefield. When American infantry finally arrived, led by a frantic Mims who had raced back, they found Patton still standing, still pointing his weapon, and 12 German soldiers sitting on the muddy ground, their hands still raised in surrender, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and profound bewilderment. "General Patton," the young infantry lieutenant gasped, utterly dumbfounded by the surreal scene. "Sir, what are you doing here? Taking prisoners by yourself?" Patton merely lowered his revolver, holstering it with a satisfied air. "Get them processed, Lieutenant, quickly." Later, through a translator, the German squad leader, still visibly shaken, asked, Who was that officer, the one with the pistols?" When informed it was General Patton, commander of the Third Army, the German's face went ashen, a flicker of horrified recognition crossing his features. "I surrendered to Patton," he murmured in disbelief. "He was alone." "Yes, we could have killed him." The translator noted, "But you didn't." The German shook his head, a haunted look in his eyes. "He had the eyes of a madman. We were afraid of what he would do if we moved. We were afraid of him." The forest encounter quickly became another legendary chapter in Patton's increasingly unbelievable saga, a testament to his sheer force of will and a psychological dominance that transcended mere firepower. December 1944. The brutal, unforgiving winter descended upon the Western Front, mirroring the grim reality of the ongoing conflict. Near the heavily contested city of Koblenz, Patton's infamous habit of forward reconnaissance nearly claimed his life, a testament to the ever-present dangers he so defiantly courted. He was driving through recently captured territory, a landscape still littered with the detritus of battle and the lingering scent of danger. The area was supposedly secured, according to the latest intelligence, but Patton trusted nothing less than his own eyes, his own instinct. His jeep, with Sergeant Mims at the wheel, rumbled along a narrow, icy road, flanked by skeletal trees and bomb-cratered fields. The air hung heavy with a sense of foreboding. Suddenly, without warning, German artillery opened up. Not a random shelling, but a targeted, delayed ambush, aiming at what they mistakenly believed to be a vulnerable supply convoy. Shells, screaming like banshees from the gray, overcast sky, began to explode around the jeep with terrifying proximity. Mims, a seasoned veteran of Patton's reckless excursions, swerved desperately, his hands locked on the wheel, trying to navigate the vehicle through the deadly maelstrom of exploding earth, mud, and shrapnel. Each impact sent violent shockwaves through the vehicle, rattling their teeth and blurring their vision. Then, a deafening concussion that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. One shell, seemingly guided by malicious intent, landed a mere 5 feet from the jeep. The explosion was immense, a blinding flash of orange and black, followed by a violent roar that momentarily stole all sound. The force of it lifted the jeep, twisting it grotesquely, before slamming it back down, overturned, a mangled hulk of metal. Patton, by some miracle of timing or sheer force of will, was thrown clear. He landed hard on the frozen ground, the wind knocked from his lungs, a searing pain shooting through his shoulder and arm, but rolled instantly to his feet, his mind already assessing the situation with terrifying clarity. "Mims!" he bellowed, his voice raw, struggling to be heard above the continuous ear-splitting shelling. His loyal driver, his ever-present shadow, was trapped beneath the twisted wreckage of the overturned jeep, unconscious. A dark, rapidly spreading stain blossoming on the pristine snow beneath his head. Patton's heart, usually a steady drumbeat of resolve, now hammered with a desperate urgency. He couldn't leave Mims. Another shell screamed in, a chilling, escalating crescendo, and Patton instinctively dove flat, pressing himself into the frozen earth as it exploded a mere 20 yards away, showering him with freezing mud, rock fragments, and the acrid stench of cordite. Ignoring his own pain, the relentless danger, and the deafening cacophony, Patton crawled frantically towards the jeep. He strained, grunting with immense effort, trying to lift the heavy vehicle, to free his driver, but it was impossible. The weight was too great. Mims was trapped, utterly vulnerable to the next deadly barrage. A surge of impotent fury, rare for the stoic general, pulsed through him. Just then, like an apparition of salvation, an American Sherman tank rumbled into view, its powerful engine a roaring counterpoint to the artillery, its tracks churning the mud and snow. It was part of a patrol, drawn by the sudden concentrated artillery fire, a beacon of hope in the chaos. "General Patton!" the tank commander shouted from the turret, his voice thick with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. He had seen the unmistakable figure, even amidst the explosions, struggling desperately with the overturned jeep. "Get over here! And help me lift this jeep! My driver's trapped!" Patton roared back, his command instantly overriding the tank commander's shock and uncertainty. The tank crew, highly trained and disciplined, jumped down from their armored beast without hesitation, their faces grim. Together, their combined strength straining, they managed to lift the jeep just enough to pull Mims out from beneath the crushed metal. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his head, several ribs clearly broken, but he was alive, a faint pulse fluttering at his neck. "Sir, what in God's name are you doing out here?" the tank commander demanded, still incredulous, as Patton, seemingly oblivious to his own wounds, began methodically dusting himself off, his eyes already scanning the horizon for the next threat. "Reconnaissance," Patton replied, his voice laced with grim humor, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "And apparently running into an ambush." He pointed to a position on his mud-splattered map, his finger firm. "Radio headquarters. Tell them German artillery is active in this sector. This whole area needs to be reassessed and quickly. Our lines are compromised." It was then that the tank commander noticed the general's arm. "Sir, you're bleeding," he exclaimed, pointing to Patton's left sleeve. Patton glanced down. His arm was cut, a deep gash weeping crimson against his olive-drab uniform, undoubtedly from shrapnel or the violent impact of being thrown. "It's nothing," he snapped, dismissing it with a casual wave of his uninjured hand, his stoicism absolute. "Get Mims to a medic. He needs immediate attention. And get him back to a field hospital." The tank commander hesitated, concern etched on his face. "Sir, you should go too. You're wounded." Patton fixed him with a steely glare that brooked no argument. "I said it's nothing. I have 3 more positions to scout today. The war waits for no man, least of all a general with a scratch." With that, he commandeered a spare, intact vehicle from the tank unit, his legendary resolve utterly unbroken, and continued his perilous reconnaissance, leaving the stunned tank crew to deal with the aftermath, and Mims to the care of medics. That evening, when his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, finally caught up with him, a man whose patience was constantly tested by his commander's antics, he nearly exploded. "Sir, you were nearly killed today. Sergeant Mims is in the hospital with a severe concussion and multiple broken ribs. When, for the love of God, are you going to stop taking these insane, suicidal risks?" Patton, his arm roughly but expertly bandaged by a hurried medic, merely looked at him with an expression of weary defiance. "When the war is over, Gay," he replied, his voice flat, the words etched with an iron will, "or I'm dead, whichever comes first." For Patton, the pursuit of victory and his unique, terrifying way of achieving it was worth any personal cost, even the prospect of his own demise. He would command from the front, even if it killed him. The sheer audacity of General Patton's behavior did not go unnoticed by his adversaries. After the war, historians sifting through mountains of captured German documents unearthed intelligence reports from late 1944 that spoke volumes about the psychological impact of his personal reconnaissance. One particular report, compiled by a bewildered but highly competent German intelligence officer, stood out with chilling clarity, a testament to the pervasive confusion and dismay Patton sowed in enemy ranks. His actions were a constant, unpredictable thorn in their side. The document, dated December 1944, was starkly titled, Assessment of American General Patton's Unconventional Activities. Its contents read like a bizarre fable, yet were meticulously logged with precise dates and unit sightings. Subject, General Patton, repeatedly appears in forward areas with minimal security. Multiple sightings confirmed by different units, often deep within what should be secure German territory. The officer had compiled a litany of unbelievable incidents. October 15th. Spotted observing bridge near Metz. Alone, standing and open, apparently unconcerned about sniper fire. Held position for extended period, binoculars to eyes. Our snipers reported confusion, inability to justify engagement without clear orders, fearing a trap or a highly valuable decoy. November 8th. Encountered by patrol in Hurtgen Forest. Captured entire patrol single-handedly. Details unclear. Patrol refuses to explain how one man captured 12 armed soldiers. Psychological impact profound, bordering on demoralization for the affected unit. November 20th. Drove through village, near Verdun, later confirmed as the village Mims and Patton accidentally drove through. We controlled. Single Jeep. We did not recognize him until too late. Mistook for lost supply officer. Displayed extreme arrogance, waving casually at our troops as if on a leisurely Sunday drive. The report's assessment of Patton was a fascinating blend of grudging admiration and utter bewilderment. Subject exhibits reckless disregard for personal safety, appears to have no fear of death. Behavior is either evidence of extreme courage or profound mental instability, possibly both. The German intelligence officer, attempting to grapple with the unprecedented anomaly that was Patton, offered a chilling recommendation. If Patton is spotted, attempt capture rather than kill. An American general as prisoner would be immensely valuable for morale and propaganda, a significant blow to the Allied command structure. However, approach with extreme caution. Subject is armed and highly unpredictable. Previous encounters suggest he poses a significant personal threat even when outnumbered, exhibiting a terrifying, almost primal confidence. A secondary, almost despairing note was scrawled at the bottom. All attempts to predict Patton's movements have failed. He appears at random locations without pattern or discernible logic. Traditional intelligence methods are utterly ineffective against this individual, rendering our usual countermeasures useless. The report ended with a handwritten, almost prayer-like plea, scrawled in the margin, underlining the profound impact Patton had on the German war machine. Thank God the Americans only have one of him. This sentiment, echoed by countless German commanders and soldiers, cemented Patton's image not just as a formidable tactician, but as an almost supernatural force on the battlefield, a ghost in the machine of war that defied all conventional understanding. He was the embodiment of audacious terror, a general who fought not just with tanks and artillery, but with sheer, unadulterated psychological warfare by simply being there, challenging the enemy's very perception of reality. His presence alone was enough to sow doubt, fear, and utter confusion in the hearts of his enemies, making him as formidable as a full division. January 1945. The war continued its grinding, bloody march, but even amidst the grand strategy and the clash of armies, the seemingly minor, yet perpetually dangerous antics of General George S. Patton became a recurring thorn in the side of Supreme Headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, a man known for his calm demeanor, strategic gravitas, and immense patience, finally decided enough was enough. The reports of Patton's reckless abandon had reached a critical mass. He summoned Patton to a private meeting, an encounter infused with the palpable tension of a ticking bomb, a clash of wills between two giants. "George, sit down," Eisenhower began, his voice surprisingly soft, but with an underlying steel that Patton immediately recognized. The pleasantries were omitted, the gravity of the situation was implicit. Patton, who had anticipated this confrontation, complied, taking a seat opposite Eisenhower's large polished desk. His expression was impassive, though a flicker of defiance danced deep in his eyes like distant lightning. He knew exactly what was coming. The torrent of complaints, the formal reports, the whispered grievances from his own staff, and the numerous brazen near-death experiences they had finally reached the highest echelon of Allied command. "I've received reports," Eisenhower continued, leaning forward, his gaze firm, unwavering, "that you're still driving to the front lines without proper security, that you've been spotted behind enemy lines multiple times, that you nearly got killed last month when your Jeep was hit by artillery near Koblenz, and your driver, Sergeant Mims, was severely injured. These are not minor incidents, George. They are a pattern of unacceptable risk-taking that jeopardizes not just yourself, but the entire command structure." Patton, ever the contrarian, interjected smoothly, a characteristic dismissiveness in his tone. "Intelligence reports are often exaggerated, Ike. You know how the stories get embellished in the fog of war. Soldiers like to spin a good yarn." Eisenhower cut him off, his voice sharpening, losing its initial softness. "These reports came from your own staff, George. From Gay, from your own chief of staff, who is absolutely terrified you're going to get yourself killed and lose the Third Army, its commander. He's at his wit's end, constantly pleading for an intervention. Your risks are causing immense anxiety among your most loyal officers." Patton merely scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand. "My chief of staff worries too much, Ike. He's a good man, but he needs to develop a thicker skin, and perhaps a bit more faith in his commanding general's ability to survive." Eisenhower pinched the bridge of his nose, a rare, visible gesture of profound frustration from the usually unflappable Supreme Commander. "George, you're the commander of the Third Army. You're not a scout. You're not a forward observer. You're indispensable. If you get killed, we lose one of our best, most aggressive, and most effective generals at a critical juncture in this war. The blow to morale alone would be immeasurable, a strategic victory for the Germans that they couldn't achieve with a dozen divisions." Patton, however, remained unyielding, his jaw set with an almost belligerent resolve. "If I don't scout the terrain myself, Ike, I make bad decisions. Maps lie. Intelligence is wrong, often outdated or colored by the fears of those who report it. Reconnaissance officers report what they are told to report, or what they think I want to hear. The only way I can command effectively is to see the battlefield with my own eyes. I must feel the ground beneath my boots, understand the currents of battle, assess the enemy's spirit firsthand. How can I ask men to bleed on ground I haven't personally surveyed?" "And take security with you," Eisenhower pleaded, exasperated, his voice rising in frustration. "At least a full company, a patrol, a squadron of tanks, something to protect you." Patton shook his head emphatically, a gesture of absolute refusal. "Security slows me down, Ike, makes me a target. A convoy draws attention, signals importance. I move faster and safer alone, or with a single, unassuming driver like a ghost through enemy lines. A single Jeep looks insignificant. Who targets a lost supply officer?" The logic, twisted though it was, held an undeniable, self-serving truth for Patton. Eisenhower threw his hands up in a gesture of utter surrender to the general's unshakable will. "George, you drove through a German-held village in August. You captured German soldiers single-handedly in November. You nearly died in December in a shell hole. This isn't reconnaissance, George. This is suicide with extra steps. You are playing Russian roulette with the Third Army's command structure and with your own life, a life vital to the Allied cause." "I'm still alive," Patton pointed out, a triumphant, almost childish glint in his eyes, as if his continued existence was irrefutable proof of the soundness of his method. "By luck, not judgment," Eisenhower retorted, his voice strained with barely contained anger. "Call it what you want, Ike," Patton concluded, his tone firm, a note of finality in his voice that signaled the end of the debate. "Third Army moves faster and fights better because I know the terrain intimately, because I see what needs to be seen. I won't command from behind a desk, Ike. I won't. Not when there are men out there fighting and dying." Eisenhower sighed, a long, weary sound that spoke of burdens far heavier than mere military tactics. He knew he wasn't going to win this argument. Patton's will was unbreakable, his conviction absolute. "At least promise me you'll take more precautions, George. Think of your men, if not yourself. Think of the precedent you're setting." Patton grinned, a rare, genuine smile that softened his hard features for a fleeting moment, a glimpse of the charismatic devil beneath the iron exterior. "I'll take all necessary precautions, Ike." Eisenhower narrowed his eyes, a sardonic twist to his lips. "That's not a real promise, and you know it." Patton's grin widened, a flash of pure mischief. "It's the best you're going to get." Eisenhower could only shake his head. The unpredictable genius was not to be tamed, not even by the Supreme Commander. His audacious recklessness was his greatest strength and his most terrifying flaw, a paradox personified. April 1945. The Third Reich was in its death throes, its once formidable armies now a fractured, desperate echo of their former strength. The monstrous behemoth of war was drawing its final ragged breaths. Yet, true to his nature, Patton felt compelled to undertake one last, personal reconnaissance mission. He drove deep into German territory, Mims again at the wheel, towards a position his map still stubbornly indicated as contested, a pocket of resistance clinging to a dying cause. Instead of the expected sounds of battle, the snarl of machine guns, the distant thunder of artillery, they found an eerie, unnatural quiet. Rounding a bend in a war-weary road, they discovered not a fortified position, but a German military hospital. It was a somber, temporary affair, housed in a grand, albeit damaged, stone building. Wounded soldiers, their faces pale and drawn, lay on cots stretching into long, makeshift wards. Nurses, their uniforms stained, moved with quiet desperation. Doctors, haggard and exhausted, labored ceaselessly. There were no combat troops, no visible defenses, just medical personnel and their suffering patients, a stark tableau of humanity's shared agony, transcending national divides. Patton got out of the jeep, his boots crunching on the gravel drive, and walked into the building. The air was thick with the antiseptic smell of carbolic acid mingled with the faint, metallic scent of blood and the pervasive odor of fear and suffering. A German doctor, his face streaked with fatigue and worry, saw him, recognized the American uniform, and froze, his hands instinctively rising, a silent plea for mercy. "How many patients?" Patton asked, his German rough but understandable, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his reputation. 200, Herr General," the doctor stammered, his eyes wide, anticipating a harsh arrest or worse. "Wounded. We have no weapons here. This is a hospital purely for the sick and injured." Patton's gaze swept across the makeshift wards, observing the rows of injured men, the desperate efforts of the medical staff. He saw the overflowing bandages, the exhausted faces, the sheer, overwhelming scale of human suffering. He turned back to the doctor, his eyes holding a rare, profound empathy. "You will not be harmed," Patton declared, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Medical personnel are protected by international law. You are doctors, not soldiers. You have wounded to care for. Do your job. Continue your work without fear." He paused, then added, "I'll send American medics to assist you, and they will bring supplies. These people need help." The German doctor stared, utterly speechless. Then a slow, dawning comprehension spread across his exhausted features. You are not arresting us?" He finally managed to stammer, hope flickering in his eyes. "You're doctors, not soldiers," Patton repeated, his voice softened. "You have wounded to care for. Do your duty. I expect nothing less." Patton walked out, got back in the jeep. "Sir," Mims asked, a touch of confusion in his voice, "should we call for troops to secure the hospital? Maybe take the doctors as prisoners?" Patton shook his head. "No. Send medics, and tell them to bring plenty of supplies. Those people," he said, gesturing back at the hospital, "need help. Real help. Not just a change of guards." That evening, American medical units reached the hospital, laden with precious supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, fresh bandages, and food. They found the German doctors and nurses still working, still caring for their patients because an American general had told them they were safe, because an enemy had shown them compassion. "Was he really Patton?" a German nurse asked through a translator, her voice still trembling with disbelief. "Yes. He walked in alone. No guards. That's Patton." She shook her head, a mix of awe and terror in her eyes. "He is either very brave or very crazy." The American medic who overheard her simply nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Both," he replied. "Definitely both." It was a final, poignant act of defiance against the dehumanizing logic of war, a moment of profound, unexpected grace from the most unlikely of sources. 8 months after the guns of World War II fell silent across Europe, 8 months after the triumph and the surrender, the man who had cheated death countless times on the battlefield met his unexpected end. December 9th, 1945. General George S. Patton was still in Germany, serving as military governor of Bavaria, a role he found frustratingly mundane after the adrenaline-fueled highs of combat command. The fighting was over, the enemy vanquished, but his ingrained habits persisted. He still drove himself around, still refused the heavy security detail that would have been appropriate for a man of his stature, still insisted on seeing things personally, cutting through bureaucratic layers with his characteristic bluntness. His staff often despaired. "Sir, it's peacetime now," his new driver, a young corporal, once ventured timidly. "You don't need to put yourself at risk." Patton had simply grunted, "A soldier is always at risk, Corporal, and a general must always be prepared." On that crisp December day, his black Cadillac sedan was traveling on a seemingly innocuous road near Mannheim. The landscape was quiet, slowly beginning to heal from the wounds of war. Then, without warning, a lumbering U.S. Army truck driven by a sergeant on a routine supply run turned suddenly in front of him, its driver apparently failing to see the approaching sedan or misjudging its speed. The collision was almost surreal in its mundane banality. It wasn't a serious crash by wartime standards, a fender bender compared to the shellings and ambushes Patton had walked away from. The truck driver was shaken, but unhurt. Patton's own driver, though startled, was fine. But Patton, sitting in the back seat, usually a position of greater safety, was caught off guard. The impact hurled him violently forward. His head struck a metal partition with a sickening thud. His neck snapped back with brutal force, a silent internal catastrophe unfolding within his legendary frame. The immediate aftermath was quiet, almost too quiet. The drivers exchanged bewildered glances, assessing the minor damage to their vehicles. Then, a low moan from the back seat. "I'm in trouble," Patton said calmly, his voice thin, almost distant. "I can't move my legs." His words, devoid of panic, were perhaps the most chilling he had ever uttered. The man who had faced down German patrols with a single pistol, who had walked through hails of artillery, was utterly helpless, paralyzed from the neck down. He was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg, a place where he had often visited wounded soldiers, never imagining he would be a patient himself. The injury was severe: a fractured cervical vertebra, devastating spinal cord damage. For 12 agonizing days, he lay paralyzed, confined to his bed, struggling to breathe, his once indomitable body betraying him. "This is a hell of a way to die," he told visitors, his eyes burning with frustration and a bitter irony. "Not in battle, not by the hand of an enemy, but in a goddamn car accident, in peacetime, on a quiet road." His spirit, though trapped, remained defiantly unbroken, his mind as sharp as ever. But his physical presence, the very instrument of his will, was gone. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton, the legendary Old Blood and Guts, succumbed to his injuries. He was 60 years old, the man who had survived 4 years of driving into combat zones, who had encountered enemy soldiers alone and prevailed against impossible odds, who seemed impossible to kill, died not with a bang, but with the tragic whimper of a traffic accident. The irony was devastating. A cruel twist of fate for a man who had courted death so fearlessly on the grandest stages of war. His relentless pursuit of seeing the unseen, that ultimate control over his battlefield, had ultimately led him to a mundane, accidental end. News of General Patton's death, even in the subdued post-war era, sent ripples across Europe. When German officers, now prisoners of war or struggling to rebuild their shattered lives, heard about it, their reactions were complicated, a tangled web of resentment, respect, and profound irony. They had hated him, feared him, but undeniably they had also admired him. "He was a bastard," one former Wehrmacht general, his uniform now replaced with civilian clothes, conceded with a grimace, recalling the relentless pressure of Patton's Third Army. But he was a magnificent bastard, the best tank commander either side had, a true master of maneuver warfare. He understood the art of the offensive better than anyone. Another, a captured panzer commander, shook his head in disbelief. "I heard he used to drive to the front lines alone, or with just a driver. I never believed it. It was too insane, until we captured some of his soldiers and they confirmed it. The man was insane. Truly, utterly mad, but effective." A third German officer, who had faced Patton's lightning advances across France, spoke with a mixture of weariness and grudging awe. "When we heard Patton was commanding against us, we knew we were in trouble. He attacked like a whirlwind, like an oppressive storm. He moved like lightning across the landscape, never gave us time to rest or regroup, never allowed us to establish a coherent defense. I hated him for the relentless pressure, for the utter destruction he brought, but I respected him. He was a general who led from the front, a rare breed." Perhaps the most poignant reaction came from a captured German intelligence officer, the very man who had compiled the reports on Patton's bizarre habits. "We tried to kill him so many times," he stated, his voice devoid of malice now, merely observation. "Artillery, snipers, ambushes, even air raids we hoped would catch his forward movements. He should have died a dozen times over, 100 times, given his recklessness. The fact that he survived the entire war, despite deliberately putting himself in harm's way almost daily, and then died in a simple car accident, that," he said, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips, "that is the universe's ultimate sense of humor. A final, cruel joke on a truly fearless man." George S. Patton, in the 4 years of the war, had done things no general should do, things that defied every military manual and common sense. Driving to the front lines without security, walking through contested territory alone, encountering enemy soldiers and either capturing them or bluffing his way past them, scouting terrain personally under fire, completely exposed. His staff begged him to stop. Eisenhower ordered him to stop. Common sense screamed for him to stop. He never stopped. "Why do you do it?" an aide once asked him, echoing the unvoiced question of thousands. Why risk your life when you have intelligence officers and scouts to do this for you? Patton thought for a moment. Then his eyes, full of a fierce, unyielding conviction, met the aide's. "Because I'm asking young men to die for me," he replied, his voice low but firm. "The least I can do is share their danger. If I'm not willing to risk my life, why should they risk theirs?" It was a noble sentiment, a profound articulation of leadership, but it was also undeniably insane. Yet, it was precisely this blend of audacious courage and tactical brilliance that made Patton the most feared Allied commander of the war. Not just because of his aggressive tactics or his blistering pace, but because his soldiers knew their general wouldn't ask them to go anywhere he wouldn't go first. When German soldiers encountered Patton where he shouldn't be, standing on a bridge under fire, driving through their positions, walking alone in no man's land, they faced an impossible choice. They could shoot an American general, one of the most valuable targets in the war, or they could surrender to a man so confident, so fearless, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility that being outnumbered didn't seem to matter to him. Most chose surrender, paralyzed by his sheer audacity, because Patton had something that transcended tactics or firepower: absolute, unshakable confidence in his own destiny. He wasn't invincible, of course. He died in a car accident on a quiet road, a mundane end for an extraordinary life. But he had spent 4 years convincing both his own soldiers and the enemy that he was. And that belief, that terrifying, almost mythical aura, won battles. "Sir, you can't go there," his staff said 1,000 times. And 1,000 times Patton went anyway, until the day he couldn't anymore. His legend, however, lives on, a testament to a man who dared to look death in the eye, and for a time made it blink. The screech of tires tore through the desolate quiet, a metallic shriek that echoed across the shell-pocked landscape, momentarily eclipsing the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery. It was March 1945. The German border near Trier, less a line on a map and more a scar carved deep into the earth, still reeking of cordite and shattered hopes. Dust, the ubiquitous acrid breath of war, billowed violently around the olive-drab Jeep as Sergeant John Mims, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, slammed the brakes. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that followed the sudden stop. Ahead, a lumbering German supply truck, an Opel Blitz, had skidded to a halt, its grimy canvas cover sagging like a weary beast. Its occupants, 6 German soldiers, gaunt and mud-splattered, clad in their field-gray uniforms that blended seamlessly with the grim environment, were frozen. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and the ever-present shadow of fear, were now masks of absolute, unadulterated bewilderment. They stared back at the impossible vision before them. In the passenger seat of the American Jeep sat a man who seemed to defy the very laws of war: General George S. Patton. An M1 helmet, a symbol of American resolve, was perched at a jaunty, almost arrogant angle on his head, but it was the twin glint of pearl-handled revolvers, holstered conspicuously at his hips, that truly announced his presence. No rank insignia adorned his plain field jacket, no identifying markers beyond the formidable force of his aura. Just an American general, impossibly, breathtakingly deep behind what should have been impenetrable enemy lines. A living legend, casually observing what few others would dare to glimpse. The air thrummed with a terrifying stillness, thick with the unspoken question: "What are you doing here?" For 3 eternal seconds, time itself seemed to warp and stretch. The only sounds were the strained groans of cooling metal from the vehicles and the frantic pounding of Mims's own heart, threatening to burst from his chest. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his spine, a testament to the primal fear that gripped him. He had seen battle, faced death countless times, but this was an entirely different breed of madness. The Germans, initially reaching for their Kar 98Ks with the ingrained reflex of seasoned soldiers, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to lower their weapons. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and sheer exhaustion, scanned the impossible figure before them. Then, one, a young corporal, his face a canvas of terror and desperate resignation, slowly, tentatively, raised his hands into the cold, damp air. A silent, desperate act of surrender. Patton's eyes, usually ablaze with an almost manic intensity, held a flicker of grim satisfaction. He took the unlit cigar from his mouth, a faint wisp of smoke curling from its tip as he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Smart choice." The words, barely audible above the ringing in Mims's ears, sealed the surreal encounter. This was not a calculated maneuver, not a planned reconnaissance mission. This was just another Tuesday for General George S. Patton, a man who considered maps mere suggestions, intelligence reports charming fictions, and the front line simply a point of personal interest. A general who, time and again, plunged himself into the very maw of the beast, convinced that true command could only be forged in the searing crucible of direct, unfiltered experience. This was the most insane, the most reckless, and perhaps the most brilliant habit of the most unpredictable general of World War II. It was a habit that baffled his own staff, terrified his drivers, and utterly confounded German intelligence. And it was a habit that would forge his legend, irrevocably linking his name with audacious courage and a profound, almost suicidal disregard for personal safety. Long before that fateful roadside encounter near Trier, the legend of Patton's audacious personal reconnaissance began to coalesce in the shattered orchards and hedgerows of Normandy in July 1944. Most generals, prudent and pragmatic, relied on the meticulous reports of their intelligence officers, poring over detailed maps, aerial photographs, and intercepted radio communications. They commanded from the relative safety of their headquarters, a necessary remove from the chaos of the immediate front. But Patton? He scoffed at such conventional wisdom. "Maps lie," he would often declare, his voice resonating with an almost religious conviction. "Intelligence is always wrong. The only way to understand the battlefield is to be on it." His chief of staff, a perpetually anxious man named Major General Hobart Gay, would often protest, his voice a tight, strained whisper. "Sir, that's what reconnaissance units are for. We have highly trained men whose sole purpose is to gather this information, men expendable in a way a commanding general is not." Patton would simply fix him with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore directly into one's very soul, and retort, "Reconnaissance units tell me what they see, Gay. I need to see what they miss." And so a habit was born, a peculiar obsession that would traumatize his staff, mystify his allies, and utterly baffle the seasoned officers of German intelligence.
Thank you for listening. Please share your thoughts, like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe for more.